The silence wasn't empty. It was pressurized. Amina stared at the grain of the wood, her knuckles white. Ethan didn't look like a savior. He looked like a mountain. The essay you submitted, it was technical, precise. But sitting here now, you're not saying anything. Why is that? She swallowed hard, her throat tight. I thought the numbers were the point. I thought if the math was right, I wouldn't have to explain myself. The math is fine. I have computers for math. I'm asking why you're shaking. She looked up, her gaze snapping to his. Her voice was too quiet, a controlled vibration. It's my first time being here, in a room where the air feels like it costs more than my rent. A jagged breath. Please, just be gentle. I don't know the right way to be high potential yet. He froze. He was supposed to ask about her 5-year plan. Instead, he felt a sudden, sharp pang of intrusive guilt. You think I'm here to break you? I think you could do it without even noticing you had. Across from her, Ethan Blackwood didn't move. He didn't lean forward. He didn't smile. He didn't interrupt. For a man worth billions, a man used to rooms bending to his presence, this was unfamiliar territory. He had expected nerves. He had expected rehearsed answers. He had not expected honesty delivered like a confession. What neither of them realized in that moment was that this sentence, spoken without drama, without manipulation, had already set forces in motion that would follow them both for years. And this wasn't about intimacy. It was about power. Amina Cole had never imagined herself here. Not in this building, not on this floor, not sitting across from a man whose name appeared in business headlines more often than weather reports. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment where the walls were thin and the future felt thinner. Her world was built on routines, early mornings, late nights, scholarships, deadlines. She believed in effort because she had no alternative. Ethan's world, on the other hand, was built on leverage. At 29, he had founded, scaled, and exited 2 tech companies. His foundation funded schools, innovation labs, and opportunity pipelines, as his PR team liked to call them. People described him as disciplined, private, and ruthless when necessary. They also described him as alone, though never to his face. Their paths were not supposed to cross, but they did, through a program that promised access to high-potential youth from underserved backgrounds. Amina had applied on a whim after her university advisor insisted. She didn't expect to make it past the first round. When the email came inviting her to a final interview, she read it 3 times to make sure it was real. Now she was here, and suddenly, everything felt very real. Ethan studied her the way he studied markets, not for weakness, but for truth. She wasn't polished. She didn't try to impress him with buzzwords or exaggerated confidence. She answered questions directly, sometimes too directly. When she didn't know something, she said so. That alone set her apart. But it also made her vulnerable. Because I don't want to owe my future to luck. It was the first time he leaned forward. As the conversation progressed, the imbalance in the room became impossible to ignore. He controlled the outcome. She knew it. He knew she knew it. Every answer she gave felt like a tightrope walk between honesty and self-preservation. That was when she said it, not rehearsed, not calculated. A sentence shaped by instinct rather than strategy. It's my first time. She wasn't talking about him. She was talking about this world, about rooms like this, about being evaluated by someone whose decisions could rewrite her life in a single signature. And Ethan understood that immediately. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his position, not as influence, but as responsibility. Ethan watched her go, unsettled in a way quarterly losses had never managed to achieve. The offer came 3 days later. A full scholarship, a placement in the foundation's elite mentorship track, direct access to resources most people never even knew existed. On paper, it was everything she had worked for. In reality, it felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unfamiliar. Her mother cried when she told her. Her best friend celebrated. Her advisor called it a once-in-a-lifetime break. No one asked how it made her feel.
Welcome back to Storyverse Vault, my beautiful, amazing Story Vault family. You all have been so supportive, and I promise to always try my best to give you the best stories, as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time coming across my video, do comment below where you are watching from and hit subscribe to officially join the Story Vault family. Now let's get into today's story.
When she stepped into the program, the shift was immediate. New spaces, new expectations, new eyes watching her, measuring her, trying to decide what she represented. Some saw a success story in progress, others saw a symbol, a few saw a weakness. Ethan kept his distance. At first, he delegated oversight. He let his team handle logistics. He told himself that was the ethical choice, but distance didn't erase influence. Every door that opened for her carried his name somewhere in the background. Every opportunity came with unspoken assumptions. And slowly, subtly, the pressure began to build. People talked. They talked about why she had been selected. They talked about favoritism. They talked about proximity. Whispers followed her into rooms she hadn't even entered yet. Amina felt it before she understood it. The sense that her success no longer belonged entirely to her. The glow of the city lights hit the glass. Amina was packing her bag, her movements jerky and frantic. Ethan stood by the elevators. "Amina, stop! You're doing well, the board is—" He said, "Don't. Please don't do the mentor voice. Not tonight. I'm trying to help you navigate this. The articles, they're just— You're trying? You're helping?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Every time you help, another door opens, but the lock is— It's still your key. I'm doing well, but I'm not real anymore. I'm Ethan Blackwood's project. That isn't what I never intended for your name to be tied to mine like this." "But you let it happen. You liked it, didn't you? Having someone who actually spoke to you like, never mind, it doesn't matter." "It does matter. If you want me to step back, I can't undo the scholarship, but I can leave." Amina said, "No, I mean, if you leave, I'm just the girl who failed the opportunity pipeline. I'm stuck. I'm stuck with you, and I'm stuck without you." And somewhere between outrage and fear, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about opportunity anymore. It was about survival. The article didn't accuse anyone of anything. That was the most dangerous part. It used words like sources, close to the foundation, unconfirmed. It framed everything as curiosity, not allegation. A photo of Ethan stepping through the atrium doors appeared beside a blurred image of Amina walking a few steps behind him, taken on a different day, cropped to look intentional. The headline didn't name her directly, but it didn't need to. Rising beneficiary or strategic favorite. By morning, the piece had been shared thousands of times. Amina felt the impact before anyone said a word to her. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Smiles tightened. Compliments gained an edge that hadn't been there before. Even praise sounded conditional now, as if it needed to be justified. She tried to focus on her work. She told herself that if she performed well enough, none of it would matter. But performance didn't erase perception. And perception, she was learning, could be more powerful than truth. Ethan's legal team wanted to respond immediately. A clean statement, firm denial, zero tolerance for speculation. He read the draft twice and set it aside. "No," he said, "not yet." They looked at him like he'd lost perspective. He hadn't. He'd gained it. Any response from him would only make the imbalance louder. A billionaire publicly defending an 18-year-old would confirm the very narrative they were trying to avoid. Silence, for now, was restraint. Or at least that was what he told himself. Amina didn't hear from him that day. What she did hear were questions. Not direct ones, never direct. Subtle probes wrapped in professional language. How are you handling the attention? Are you comfortable being in the spotlight so early? Do you feel sufficiently supported? Each one reminded her that the spotlight wasn't something she had chosen. That night, she called her mother and didn't mention the article. She talked about classes, deadlines, the exhaustion that sat in her bones. Her mother listened, proud and unaware. When the call ended, Amina sat in the dark for a long time, wondering how quickly pride could turn into concern if the story spread further. The next interaction with Ethan happened behind closed doors, and that alone felt like a mistake. It wasn't secret. It wasn't hidden. It was scheduled, documented, professional. But the optics no longer belonged to logic. "You should have told me," she said as soon as the door closed. Ethan didn't argue. "You're right." That answer disarmed her more than any defense would have. "I didn't want to make it worse," he added. "Every move I make right now has consequences for you." She laughed once, sharp and humorless. "That's been true since the moment I walked into this building." The silence stretched, thick with things neither of them could say out loud. "I don't want special treatment," she said finally. "I never did." "I know." "Then why does it feel like I'm paying for something I didn't ask for?" Because power was never neutral. Because proximity always came with a cost. He didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, "We need to put distance between us." Her chest tightened, not because she wanted closeness, but because distance now felt like abandonment. "So you believe them?" she asked quietly. "No," he said immediately. "I believe you." The problem was that belief didn't protect reputations. Structures did, and structures were built by people like him. They agreed on boundaries, formal channels only, no unscheduled conversations, oversight handled by a third party. On paper, it was the correct decision. In reality, it felt like a demotion she hadn't earned. As the days passed, the pressure escalated. Another article followed, then a segment on a business podcast, then a thread dissecting her background, her grades, her application. People who had never met her debated whether she was talented or merely lucky. Others went further, speculating about her intentions. Amina stopped reading after someone wrote, "She knew exactly what she was doing." She didn't sleep much after that. Her performance slipped, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. A missed deadline, a presentation that lacked its usual sharpness. The smallest cracks drew the most attention now. Someone in the program confronted her directly. "Are you here because you deserve it?" the girl asked, not unkindly. "Or because of him?" Amina stared at her, stunned by how calmly the question had been asked. "I deserve to be here," she said. The girl nodded. "Then you might want to prove it faster." That night, Amina made a decision. She requested a formal review of her placement. It was unprecedented, risky, potentially humiliating. But it was the only way she could reclaim control of the narrative. If she passed an independent evaluation, blind to her identity, blind to her connection, then no one could claim she hadn't earned her position. When the request reached Ethan's desk, he understood the gamble immediately. If she failed, it wouldn't just confirm the rumors, it would end her trajectory entirely. He called her. It was the first time he'd broken the boundaries they'd agreed on. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Yes, I do," she replied. "Because if I don't, this will follow me forever." He closed his eyes. He saw the logic. He saw the courage. He also saw the cruelty of a system that demanded proof from her and not from anyone else. "I won't interfere," he said. "I don't want you to." That answer mattered more than she realized. The review process was brutal. Panels, simulations, timed evaluations, no allowances, no context, just performance under pressure. Amina threw herself into it with the kind of focus that bordered on desperation. For the first time since the story broke, she felt something close to clarity. Ethan watched from the sidelines, bound by the very restraint he'd chosen. He resisted every instinct to step in, to smooth edges, to shield her. This was her fight now. And if he truly respected her, he had to let her face it alone. Midway through the process, a new variable entered the equation. Someone leaked internal emails. Not incriminating, not explicit, but selectively framed to suggest familiarity, a tone, a pattern, enough to reignite the conversation just as it was beginning to cool. The foundation went into damage control. Board members called emergency meetings. Advisors questioned whether the mentorship program itself had become a liability. Someone floated the idea of suspending Amina's placement until things settled. Ethan shut that down immediately. "She stays," he said. "Anything else is punishment without cause." "And if the review goes badly?" someone asked. "Then we deal with that," he replied. "Not before." The vote was split. The decision was deferred. Amina didn't know any of this. All she knew was that everything now hinged on the final evaluation. The night before the results were due, she stood alone on the balcony of her apartment, city lights blurring below. She thought about the girl she had been before all of this, the certainty, the simplicity, the belief that hard work spoke for itself. She wondered if she would ever get that version of herself back. The next morning, she walked into the evaluation room steady but hollow, carrying the weight of weeks she couldn't afford to lose. By the time she walked out, she had no idea whether she'd saved herself or sealed her fate. And as the board convened behind closed doors, one question hovered over everything. If she failed, would anyone ever believe her again? If you're finding yourself holding your breath at this point, you're not alone. This is where the story stops being about rumors and starts becoming about consequences. And the next decision would not be hers to make. The results didn't arrive all at once. They never did when the stakes were this high. They came in fragments, emails marked confidential, calendar holds without explanations, hushed conversations that stopped when Amina walked past. The waiting was its own punishment. Every hour stretched, heavy with implication. She kept replaying the evaluation in her head, dissecting every answer, every hesitation, every moment where she might have revealed too much or not enough. She told herself she had done well. She also knew that doing well was no longer the only metric that mattered. When the official notice finally came, it was brief. Preliminary findings indicate satisfactory performance. Final determination pending board review. Satisfactory, not exceptional, not transformative, just enough to keep the argument alive. Amina read the message 3 times before closing her laptop. Relief washed over her first, then frustration. She had gambled everything for clarity and had received ambiguity instead. In another context, satisfactory would have been acceptable. Here, it felt like an invitation for others to decide what her future should be. Ethan received the same update within minutes. He recognized the language immediately. It was institutional caution. The board wasn't evaluating her anymore. They were evaluating risk, optics, reputation, donor sentiment, and she had become the variable. The next board meeting was scheduled sooner than expected. Too soon. Several members had pushed for it, citing urgency. Ethan knew what that meant. Momentum favored those who wanted a clean resolution, not a fair one. He prepared his case carefully, not emotional, not defensive, focused on process and principle. He reminded himself that stepping too far in her defense could undo everything she had fought to prove. Restraint again. Amina, meanwhile, was being pulled in the opposite direction. Her mentor, assigned after the first round of controversy to balance oversight, requested a private check-in. The tone was polite but firm. When they sat down, the words came carefully measured. "You need to understand how this looks," the mentor said. Right now, you're being seen as a distraction. Amina stiffened. A distraction from what? From the Foundation's mission. I am the mission, she replied before she could stop herself. Or at least I was told I was. The mentor sighed. This isn't personal. But sometimes the cost of potential outweighs the benefit. Amina heard the implication clearly. Potential could be postponed. People could be paused. I won't step aside, she said. That may not be your decision. That was the moment something inside her hardened. Until now, she had believed that truth, once demonstrated, would carry weight. That merit could still cut through noise. But what she was facing wasn't doubt about her abilities. It was discomfort with her presence. She started documenting everything: emails, meeting notes, timelines. Not because she planned to accuse anyone, but because she needed to remind herself of what was real. Facts were grounding. Facts didn't shift with mood or pressure. At the same time, the narrative outside the building continued to evolve. A new angle emerged online. Not scandal, but sympathy. Articles framed her as too young for the spotlight, questioned whether the Foundation had acted irresponsibly by placing her in such a visible role. The tone was gentler, but the outcome was the same. She was being positioned as someone who needed to be protected from herself. Ethan read one of the pieces late at night, irritation giving way to something colder. Protection, he knew, was often just control with better branding. He considered calling her again and stopped himself. Every instinct told him to reach out. Every rational calculation told him that contact now would only validate the scrutiny. He chose distance, even as it felt increasingly hollow. The board meeting began without fanfare. Amina wasn't invited. That fact alone spoke volumes. Ethan listened as concerns were raised about donor confidence, media fatigue, internal morale. Her name was mentioned, but rarely directly. She had become a concept, a risk profile, a talking point. If you're still with this story, take a moment to like and subscribe. This is the point where it starts to matter. Not just what happens next, but why. Because the next decision would bind them both in ways neither of them fully understood yet. And neither of them would walk away unchanged. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't start with her. He started with precedent. He outlined the review process she had requested, the safeguards, the independence, the preliminary results. He reminded them that no violation had been identified, no misconduct substantiated. Then why are we still here? One member asked. Because discomfort isn't the same as wrongdoing, Ethan replied. And because if we set a standard where perception overrides performance, we compromise everything this foundation claims to stand for. There was silence after that. Not agreement, consideration. Then someone asked the question Ethan had been expecting. Are you too close to this? He answered without hesitation. If I were, I wouldn't be arguing for process over outcome. The vote was delayed again. Outside the boardroom, time moved differently. Amina began to notice how people interacted with her now, careful, cautious, as if she were made of something fragile. Invitations slowed. Feedback became vague. She was still present, but increasingly peripheral. One afternoon, she overheard two interns talking in the hallway. She's smart, one said. But it's all so messy. Yeah, the other replied. I wouldn't want to be her. Amina walked past them without stopping, her expression neutral, her pulse racing. That night, she broke down for the first time since the review began. It wasn't dramatic, no sobbing, just exhaustion collapsing into grief. She cried for the version of herself that believed excellence was enough. She cried for the way her name had been turned into shorthand for controversy. She cried because she was tired of being strong in a situation she hadn't chosen. The next morning, she made another decision. She drafted a letter, not a resignation, not an apology, a statement. It outlined her experience, her qualifications, her request for review, and her willingness to be judged solely on merit. It acknowledged the discomfort without conceding guilt. It was calm, factual, and firm. She didn't send it immediately. She knew once it was out, there would be no pulling it back. Ethan learned about the letter through a third party. His reaction was immediate and conflicted. Public statements had power, but they also escalated conflict. Once the story moved fully into the open, control would be lost, for everyone. He requested a meeting with her mentor, careful to keep it within formal bounds. "She's considering going public," he said. The mentor frowned. "That would complicate things." "She's already living with the complications," Ethan replied. "The question is whether we force her to stay silent to make ourselves more comfortable." That conversation didn't resolve anything, but it clarified one truth. The institution was bracing for impact, not justice. Amina sent the letter that evening, within hours. It was circulating internally. By morning, someone had leaked it. The internet reacted swiftly. Some praised her composure. Others accused her of manipulation. The story reignited, louder than before, now fueled by her own words. The foundation issued a holding statement. Neutral, non-committal. The board reconvened. Ethan stared at his phone, watching notifications pile up, knowing that the next call he received would change everything. Amina sat alone in her apartment, the city humming outside, aware that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She didn't know whether she had just reclaimed her voice or given everyone exactly what they needed to push her out. And as the board prepared to make its final determination, one reality became inescapable. This was no longer about whether she deserved the opportunity. It was about whether the system could survive admitting that she did. The decision was coming, and when it landed, there would be no middle ground. By the time the board reached a decision, the story had already escaped them. It wasn't just blogs anymore. Mainstream outlets picked it up, framing it as a test case. Power versus principle, influence versus integrity. Commentators argued over hypotheticals without knowing the people involved. Amina's face appeared on screens beside words like controversy and risk, as if those were traits rather than circumstances imposed on her. She stopped watching after the third segment. The call came in the early afternoon. Amina answered on the first ring, even though she had promised herself she wouldn't wait by the phone. The voice on the other end was measured, practiced. "The board has reached a provisional decision," the woman said. "Your placement will continue under revised terms." Amina closed her eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means your role will be restructured, reduced public visibility, limited access to certain programs, additional oversight." "So," Amina said slowly, "I stay, but smaller." There was a pause. That's one way to put it. The call ended with polite assurances and vague timelines. No acknowledgement of what the review had actually shown. No recognition of what she had endured to get there. She sat still for several minutes after hanging up, trying to locate the emotion she was supposed to feel. Relief never arrived. Neither did gratitude. What she felt instead was clarity. Across town, Ethan received the same update, along with a dozen messages from advisors congratulating him on a balanced outcome. Balanced, as if the scales had ever been equal. He didn't reply. The compromise angered him more than a rejection would have. It allowed the institution to appear reasonable while quietly validating the narrative that she was, in fact, a problem to be managed. It preserved the foundation's image at her expense, and it did so without ever admitting fault. When he finally spoke, it was to the board chair. "This isn't neutral," he said. "It's punitive." "It's pragmatic," the chair replied. "We can't ignore the environment we operate in." "And she has to absorb that cost?" "She's resilient," the chair said. "She'll recover." That assumption, spoken so casually, settled something in Ethan's chest. Resilience, he realized, had become an excuse, a way to demand endurance without offering protection. He asked for time to consider next steps. The chair agreed, relieved the conversation hadn't escalated further. Amina learned about the revised terms in detail 2 days later. The document was thorough, clinical, and careful to emphasize opportunity. She read it once, then again, then set it aside. The message was clear. She could stay, but only if she agreed to be less visible, less ambitious, less threatening. That night, she met her best friend for dinner. It was the first time she had spoken freely in weeks. "They want me quiet," Amina said, pushing food around her plate. "They don't want me gone. They just don't want me loud." Her friend frowned. "And what do you want?" Amina didn't answer immediately. The question felt heavier than it should have. "I want my work to matter," she said finally. "Not my silence." The following week, the foundation announced internal changes. New oversight protocols, a renewed commitment to ethics, all framed as progress, no mention of her by name. Amina continued her work, but the energy had shifted. Projects she once led were reassigned. Meetings she once attended became optional. She was present, but no longer central. People treated her kindly now, too kindly, like someone recovering from something fragile. Ethan noticed every change. He also noticed something else. Donor interest didn't drop. Public outrage didn't escalate. The storm had passed, just as some board members had predicted, at her expense. He invited an external ethics consultant to review the situation independently. It was a move that surprised his advisors and unsettled the board. "This could reopen everything," one warned. "Good," Ethan replied. The consultant's findings were blunt. No misconduct, no favoritism. Procedural integrity upheld. Reputational harm disproportionate to any risk identified. "We did what we thought was necessary," someone said. "You did what was convenient," Ethan replied. "There's a difference." The conversation ended without resolution, but the lines had been drawn. Meanwhile, Amina received an email from a journalist. The subject line was simple: "Your side." She didn't respond immediately. She reread her letter. She thought about the revised terms. She thought about how quickly her presence had become negotiable. Then she replied with one sentence: "What would you like to know?" The article that followed was careful and restrained. It focused on systems, not accusations. It quoted her directly, letting her voice stand without commentary. She didn't attack anyone. She described processes, pressures, and outcomes.
The response was immediate. Some praised her restraint. Others criticized her timing. A few accused her of prolonging the issue. But something shifted. The conversation moved away from speculation and toward structure. People began asking why she had been asked to shrink after meeting every requirement placed before her. The foundation couldn't ignore it this time. Ethan watched the coverage with a mixture of concern and admiration. She hadn't asked for permission. She hadn't waited for protection. She had chosen agency. He requested a meeting with her, formal, documented, unavoidable. When they sat across from each other again, the distance between them felt different. Not charged, clarified. "You didn't tell me you were going to speak publicly," he said. "I didn't think it was my job to manage everyone's comfort anymore," she replied. He nodded. "You're right." They talked about consequences, about fallout, about what came next. There were no reassurances, only honesty. "I won't step in front of this," Ethan said, "but I won't stand in its way either." "That's all I wanted," Amina replied, "for once." As the weeks passed, pressure mounted again, this time from outside. Advocacy groups took interest. Donors asked questions. The foundation's leadership was forced into a more transparent posture. Internal emails surfaced, again not incriminating, but revealing hesitation, fear, image management. Enough to undermine the narrative of neutrality. The board scheduled another meeting. This time, Amina was invited to speak. She prepared carefully, Not defensively, not emotionally. She focused on impact. When she finished, the room was quiet. No one applauded. No one challenged her. The silence felt different from the first time she had spoken in a powerful room. This one wasn't dismissive. It was unsettled. The vote was postponed. Again. But this delay felt less like avoidance and more like uncertainty. Outside the building, cameras waited. Inside, decisions hung suspended. If you stayed with this story this far, you can feel the shift too. This is the midpoint, the moment where the balance begins to tip, not because power changes hands, but because pressure finally meets resistance. If stories like this matter to you, stories about choice, consequence, and the quiet moments where people decide who they're going to be, this is a good moment to stay connected. Subscribe if you haven't. Share your thoughts in the comments. The conversation doesn't end when the video does. Because what comes next isn't about survival anymore. It's about what happens when the system is forced to answer for itself. And not everyone is ready for that. The silence after Amina spoke to the board lingered longer than anyone expected. No immediate statements followed. No clarifications. No spin. For an institution built on carefully timed responses, the pause itself became a message. Internally, departments waited for direction that didn't come. Externally, commentators sensed hesitation and pressed harder. The system was no longer controlling the tempo. Amina returned to her work with a strange calm. She had said what needed to be said. Whatever came next would not be shaped by her fear. That realization didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. For the first time since the story broke, she wasn't bracing for impact. She was standing still and letting it arrive. Ethan, meanwhile, was discovering how quickly resistance could turn inward. Emails from board members shifted in tone. Where there had once been collegial debate, there was now defensiveness. Some accused him, carefully, indirectly, of destabilizing the foundation by allowing the issue to linger. Others questioned whether his leadership had become a liability. One message stood out. This is becoming personal for you. He stared at the line longer than he should have. It wasn't personal, he told himself. It was structural. But he also knew that insisting on fairness always became personal to those who benefited from imbalance. That was a quiet truth no one liked to name. The ethics consultant was asked, politely, firmly, to refrain from further commentary. Donors were reassured behind closed doors. A parallel narrative began to form, that the foundation was under attack by external pressure and needed to protect its mission from distraction. Amina recognized that language immediately. Distraction. Noise. Upticks. She had become the problem again, just with better vocabulary. Her revised role officially went into effect. She was reassigned to a project with limited visibility, one that mattered but didn't lead. The change was framed as strategic alignment. In practice, it sidelined her. She accepted it without protest. That restraint unsettled people more than resistance would have. Colleagues expected frustration, maybe anger. Instead, Amina worked with quiet intensity. She delivered. She documented. She kept copies of everything. When questioned, she answered precisely and without apology. Someone asked her one afternoon why she was still trying so hard. "Because my effort isn't conditional," she replied, "even if your recognition is." Word of that response traveled quickly. Ethan heard it from someone else, and it stayed with him. It reinforced what he had been circling for weeks. The foundation's greatest risk was not scandal, it was erosion of credibility from within. The next escalation came from an unexpected direction. A junior staff member submitted a formal complaint to Human Resources. Not about Ethan, not about Amina, about the way the situation had been handled. The complaint cited shifting standards, selective enforcement, and pressure to frame decisions as neutral when they were not. It included dates, meeting notes, and internal guidance emails. It wasn't explosive. It was meticulous. HR flagged it as sensitive and escalated it directly to leadership. When Ethan was informed, his first reaction was concern, not for himself, but for the staff member. Whistleblowers were rarely protected as well as policies claimed. He pushed for safeguards immediately, documenting everything. The board, however, saw the complaint as a threat. "This is getting out of control," one member said during an emergency call. "We need to contain this." Containment is what got us here, Ethan replied. Then what do you suggest? Another asked. We can't let internal dissent define us. Ethan paused. We can let accountability refine us. That answer landed poorly. Within days, rumors surfaced that leadership restructuring was being discussed. Nothing official, just enough to create uncertainty. Ethan's advisors urged caution. Some suggested he step back publicly to cool things down. He declined. At the same time, Amina received an invitation that surprised her. A policy forum, independent, well-regarded, wanted her to speak about youth access and institutional responsibility. The request came with assurances. No sensational framing, no personal probing unless she chose it. She hesitated. Public engagement had costs. Every appearance fed the narrative that she was a symbol rather than a contributor. But silence had cost too. She accepted. The forum appearance was calm, measured, and focused. Amina spoke about systems, not individuals. She described what it meant to navigate opportunity while carrying someone else's discomfort. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She didn't perform resilience. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Clips circulated. Not virally, but steadily. The tone of the conversation shifted again, away from scandal and toward structural critique. That momentum unsettled the foundation more than outrage ever had. Another board meeting was scheduled. This time, the agenda included leadership review. Ethan read it twice before forwarding it to his legal counsel. Amina learned about the meeting through a different channel. A colleague she trusted pulled her aside. "They are looking at him now," the colleague said quietly. Amina felt a jolt of unease. "Because of me. Because of what this has become." She went home that night restless, replaying every decision she'd made since the interview. She had wanted fairness. She hadn't intended to put anyone else in the line of fire. She drafted a message to Ethan and deleted it. Then she drafted another and sent it. "I never wanted this to cost anyone their position." The reply came an hour later. Change always costs something. The question is who we asked to pay. That answer didn't reassure her. It clarified the stakes. The board meeting was closed door, longer than usual. When it ended, no statement was released. That absence spoke louder than any press release. The next morning, Ethan was asked to step away from public-facing duties pending review. It was framed as procedural, temporary, necessary for objectivity. In effect, it was a demotion. News of the decision leaked within hours. Headlines framed it as accountability. Others called it scapegoating. Analysts debated whether the foundation was correcting course or sacrificing leadership to preserve itself. Amina read the news in disbelief. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted it. And yet, it had happened in the wake of her insistence on being treated fairly. The guilt hit hard and fast. She called her mother that evening and, for the first time, told her everything. The articles, the review, the pressure, the consequences. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then her mother said, "If standing up for yourself shakes something powerful, that doesn't mean you were wrong. It means it was already unstable." Amina held on to that. Ethan spent the evening alone, the weight of the decision settling in. He wasn't surprised. He had known this was a possible outcome. What unsettled him was how easily the institution had moved to isolate him once he stopped absorbing impact quietly. He reviewed the foundation's charter late into the night. The language about integrity, about courage, about doing the right thing even when it was inconvenient. The irony wasn't lost on him. The following week brought another twist. An external audit, unrelated on paper, was announced. Financial, procedural, broad in scope, officially routine. Unofficially, it meant everything was about to be examined. The auditor's mandate included governance practices, and that meant decisions, and that meant records. Amina learned about the audit from the news. Ethan learned about it from counsel. They both understood the implication immediately. This was no longer just about optics or compromise. The system itself was about to be tested. And if the audit uncovered what careful language it concealed, if it exposed patterns rather than incidents, there would be consequences no one could manage quietly. As the process began, emails were preserved. Meetings were logged. Narratives froze in place. The foundation braced. Amina stood at her apartment window that night, watching the city move below, aware that something irreversible had been set in motion. She didn't know whether the audit would vindicate her or erase her completely. She only knew that the truth, once examined, rarely stayed contained. And somewhere deep inside the institution, the question everyone was avoiding had finally become unavoidable. If fairness threatened stability, which one would they choose to protect? The audit changed the air inside the foundation. People spoke more carefully. Emails grew shorter. Meetings ended with reminders about documentation and compliance. What had once been an ecosystem of influence now felt like a room full of mirrors, everyone suddenly aware of how they might appear from the outside. Amina felt it immediately. Requests that once came casually now arrived formally. Verbal instructions were followed up in writing. People who had avoided eye contact weeks earlier now watched her closely, as if she were both witness and warning. She didn't take satisfaction in it. Power shifting never felt clean. It felt brittle. Ethan, officially sidelined but still contractual bound, was instructed not to interfere with the audit. He complied publicly and prepared privately. He reviewed years of governance decisions, not to shield himself, but to understand the pattern the auditors would inevitably see. It was never one decision that condemned an institution. It was repetition. The auditors requested interviews, first with senior leadership, then with program managers. Then, inevitably, with Amina, the request arrived without ceremony. A calendar invite marked confidential, no explanation attached. She stared at it longer than she expected. This was the moment people warned her about, the point where speaking plainly could be reframed as disloyalty, where silence could be interpreted as complicity. There was no neutral posture left. She accepted. The interview room was smaller than she imagined. No glass walls, no observers, just two auditors and a recorder placed deliberately in the center of the table. They asked about her application, the interview, the review, the revised terms. They asked how decisions were communicated, how expectations changed, how pressure manifested. Amina answered carefully, but not cautiously. She didn't speculate. She described. She anchored every statement in sequence and context. When she didn't know something, she said so. When she did, she explained how she knew it. At one point, one of the auditors asked, "Did you ever feel discouraged from asserting yourself?" Amina paused. Then she said, "I was encouraged to be grateful." The discouragement followed naturally. The recorder kept running. Outside the room, tension built. Word spread quickly that the auditors were asking about leadership behavior, not just outcomes. That they were mapping decision trees rather than isolated incidents. People who had once dismissed Amina as a temporary issue began recalculating their positions. Some reached out to her, subtly, cautiously. "I just want you to know." One said, "I always thought you handled this with integrity." Amina nodded politely, hearing the subtext clearly. Integrity was safer to praise once it no longer threatened. Ethan's interview came 2 days later. He wasn't asked about Amina at first. He was asked about process, about oversight, about escalation paths and internal checks. He answered plainly, resisting the urge to editorialize. Then the questions narrowed. Why did you insist on delaying resolution? Why did you oppose restructuring her role? Why did you commission an external ethics review? Ethan leaned back slightly, because none of those actions addressed risk. They addressed discomfort. The auditors exchanged a look. "Do you believe the Foundation acted unfairly?" one asked. "I believe it acted defensively," Ethan replied. And defensiveness often looks like fairness when written carefully enough. That answer would either mark him as principled or insubordinate. He left the interviewer where he had crossed another line. The fallout began quietly. An internal memo circulated reminding staff of confidentiality obligations. Another emphasized the importance of organizational unity during review. The language was neutral, but the intent was clear, full in line. Amina read the memo twice and felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Unity had become code for silence. She didn't break it. What she did instead was continue performing at an undeniable level. Her project, small, underfunded, and strategically sidelined, began producing results that were impossible to ignore. Metrics improved. External partners took notice. Quietly, her work gained traction without the foundation's promotion. Success, she learned, was another kind of disruption. That disruption reached the auditors. They requested documentation related to her project. They asked why it had been deprioritized. They asked who made that decision and when. Answers varied. That inconsistency mattered. As the audit deepened, the board fractured along predictable lines. Some argued for cooperation and transparency. Others pushed for containment and legal caution. Meetings grew tense. Votes narrowed. At one such meeting, a member asked a question no one had voiced directly until now. If the audit concludes that we mishandled this, who takes responsibility? The room fell silent. Responsibility was abstract when outcomes were positive. It became dangerous when accountability loomed. Eyes shifted, not to Ethan, who was absent, but to the structures that had allowed decisions to diffuse without ownership. Amina was not present for these conversations, but she felt their effects. Her access was restricted again, not officially, but practically. Requests for data were delayed. Invitations rescinded without explanation. It wasn't punitive. It was protective. The system was closing ranks. She called her best friend that night, voice low. "I think they're trying to wait me out." Her friend didn't hesitate. "Then don't get tired." The next escalation came faster than anyone expected. A second internal complaint surfaced, this one from mid-level management. It referenced pressure to frame decisions in ways that minimized reputational impact rather than addressed root causes. It cited meetings, directives, and expectations. It named no names. It didn't need to. The auditors expanded their scope. Now, the foundation was no longer managing a review. It was responding to an investigation. Donors began asking harder questions. Not about the story, but about governance, about whether leadership was aligned with stated values, about how risk was defined. One donor paused a major contribution pending audit results. That got attention. Ethan was summoned to a meeting with legal counsel and 2 board members. The tone was serious, measured, unmistakably adversarial. "You need to consider your position," one of them said. "This process could take months. The foundation can't be perceived as unstable." "And what does that require of me?" Ethan asked. "Distance," the other replied. "Silence. Cooperation without commentary." Ethan nodded slowly. "You're asking me to step aside so the institution can survive the consequences of its own decisions. We're asking you to help protect it." Ethan met their gaze. Protection without correction is preservation of the wrong thing. The meeting ended without agreement. Amina learned about the donor pause through an industry newsletter. She closed her laptop and sat very still. This had gone beyond her, beyond Ethan, beyond reputation. Money was now on the line. That night, she received an unexpected message from someone she barely knew, a staff member from another department. "I was told to document everything related to you. I think you should know." Amina's hands trembled slightly as she typed back. "Document how?" The reply came quickly. "Every interaction, every decision, every justification." Amina understood immediately. The system wasn't just protecting itself anymore. It was building a record. She forwarded the message to her personal email. Then she added it to her growing archive. Ethan, meanwhile, made a decision he had been avoiding. He requested a formal hearing. Not internal, external. A public accounting of leadership decisions related to the situation. Voluntary, transparent. His advisors were stunned. "This could end your career," one said. Ethan replied evenly. "It might, but it will end the guessing." Word of the request spread quickly. Too quickly. The board reacted with alarm. Legal teams scrambled. Emergency sessions were called. Amina found out through the news. She felt a surge of panic, not for herself, but for him. She drafted a message and stared at it for a long time. "You don't owe this to anyone." The reply came an hour later. "I owe it to myself." The foundation issued a statement that evening. The audit was ongoing, leadership reviews were under consideration, and all parties were expected to cooperate fully. It said nothing about the hearing request. Silence again. Strategic. Calculated. The next morning, Amina was called into a meeting with HR and legal present. They thanked her for her cooperation. They reiterated confidentiality expectations. Then they offered her something new, a voluntary leave, paid, temporary, framed as support. She listened carefully. "And if I decline?" she asked. The HR representative smiled politely. "Then we'll respect your decision." The lawyer didn't smile. Amina understood the message. She walked out of the meeting steady but shaken. Voluntary leave would remove her from the building, from documentation flow, from daily visibility. Declining would mark her as non-compliant. Neither option was neutral. She stood in the elevator, heart pounding, aware that the next choice she made would define how the story ended, or whether she remained in it at all. At the same time, Ethan received a call from his counsel. "The board is preparing to vote," the lawyer said. "Not on the audit, on you." Ethan closed his eyes. Two decisions, unfolding in parallel. Two people standing at different ends of the same system. And neither of them knew which move would trigger the collapse or the correction of everything that had come before. The only certainty was this. Whatever happened next, there would be no quiet resolution. And someone was about to be asked to disappear. The morning the board vote occurred, tension had a physical weight. It wasn't in the air. It was in the elevator doors, in the hum of the fluorescent lights, in the way people paused mid-step in the hallways. Every decision, every glance, every email was being scrutinized. The foundation had become a stage, and no one could ignore the audience, even if the audience was entirely invisible. Amina arrived early, not because she wanted to witness it, but because she needed to. Standing outside the boardroom, she felt the old familiar knot of anxiety, the same one she had felt the day the first article appeared, but it was sharper now, heavier, because this time the consequences weren't abstract. Inside, the board convened. Ethan's absence was noted silently. The room felt smaller without him, though his presence lingered in every chair he should have occupied. Votes were cast, arguments rehearsed, language paused, and then the result. The board decided to uphold the leadership review, effectively sidelining him temporarily, but the language was careful, neutral, procedural, almost antiseptic. The public wouldn't understand. Headlines would spin it differently. Words like temporary, review, and protection of mission would appear, softening the blow for outside observers. Internally, though everyone understood the reality, Ethan's authority had been disrupted. Amina learned of the decision via an internal memo. She read it once, then twice, relief mixed with a pang of guilt. She had never wanted this for him. Yet, watching the system protect itself at any cost, she knew it had been inevitable. She spent the next hours cataloging every project, every email, every decision she had made over the previous months. Not for anyone else, not for recognition. For herself, to preserve her agency, the one thing no institution could take without her consent. By mid-afternoon, Ethan called. His tone was calm, measured. "They did what they needed to," he said, "but it doesn't make it right." "I know," Amina replied. "I'm documenting everything. I'm not going to disappear quietly." "Good," he said. "Neither am I." There was a pause. Not awkward, not strained, intentional. Both of them understood the stakes. Both of them understood that stepping back was never an option. Then came another twist. A leaked internal email, anonymous but unmistakably authentic, surfaced online. It documented conversations, internal deliberations, and even the reassignment of Amina's projects. The leak didn't accuse anyone directly. It didn't need to. The pattern was obvious. The system had acted to protect itself, and anyone reading could see it. Social media reacted instantly. Articles appeared questioning leadership accountability. Analysts speculated on donor confidence. The board scrambled to issue statements, framing the leak as a breach of policy rather than a reflection of their decision-making. Amina's name appeared again, not as a problem this time, but as a catalyst. She didn't seek attention, but she couldn't hide from it either. Ethan assessed the situation carefully. Every move was a calculation. Intervene and risk reinforcing the narrative of favoritism. Stay silent and risk damage to the institution and to everyone involved. He opted for a measured approach. Transparency where possible, documentation where necessary, patience where unavoidable. Meanwhile, Amina received invitations to speak at forums, policy discussions, youth empowerment panels, institutional ethics conferences. Each one offered her a platform to reframe the story without sensationalism. She accepted selectively, speaking on structure, accountability, and fairness rather than personal narrative. Her appearances began to shift the conversation. The headline softened. Analysts started asking questions about systemic issues rather than rumors. The focus moved from her as an individual to the foundation as an institution, which was exactly the change she wanted. Inside the foundation, the board began to fracture more visibly. Some members wanted aggressive containment. Others began advocating for transparency. Meetings became tense. Emails circulated with subtext that few admitted aloud. Ethan's temporary sidelining became a rallying point. Advisors warned him to be careful. He understood the risks. Yet, for the first time, he saw an opportunity to shape the narrative structurally rather than reacting emotionally. Amina and Ethan met in private later that week. "You've handled this remarkably well," he said. "I didn't have a choice," she replied. "If I folded, they would have erased me." He nodded, and if I stepped in too forcefully, it would have confirmed every rumor. They understood each other now, not in terms of authority or influence, but in shared experience and consequence. The tension between them had shifted. It was no longer about control. It was about mutual understanding of stakes and strategy. By the end of the week, external audits were underway in earnest. Financial records, decision logs, correspondence, everything relevant to the story was being reviewed independently. The atmosphere was tense, but focused. Mistakes, missteps, and biases, real perceived, would be identified. Amina continued to work quietly. Her small project produced visible results. She documented outcomes, measured impact, and kept a detailed record of communications. Her diligence began attracting subtle recognition from external stakeholders. Ethan observed from a distance, respecting boundaries but monitoring every move. He could see the system bending under scrutiny, but not breaking. Not yet. One evening, after reviewing audit reports and internal logs, Ethan finally allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The stress, the uncertainty, the public attention, it had been relentless. And yet, in it all, two things had become undeniable: Amina's competence and her unyielding resolve. He knew the foundation could survive this, but whether it would emerge stronger or merely restored to the status quo was another question entirely. The next day, a message appeared in Amina's inbox. Subject line: confidential, preliminary audit findings. She clicked it with a mixture of anticipation and dread. What she read would set the stage for the final confrontation, the moment when the truth she had fought to protect would finally be measured against the weight of the institution she had challenged. And at that moment, one reality crystallized for both of them. This was no longer just about survival. It was about setting a precedent, about proving that integrity, accountability, and courage could influence a system designed to resist change. What happens next will define not just her future, but the foundation itself. And neither of them will walk away unchanged. The preliminary audit findings landed in Amina's inbox like a silent thunderclap. She stared at the screen, reading and rereading the words that confirmed what she had suspected and feared. The report was clear. Procedural missteps had occurred. Oversight had been inconsistent. Decisions had been framed to protect optics rather than enforce fairness. And while no malicious intent was documented, the consequences had been real. Her first instinct was relief. Finally, an impartial voice had validated what she had endured. But relief was fleeting. The audit also confirmed that the system she had challenged was fragile, vulnerable to manipulation and fear. That realization was heavier than the vindication. Ethan received his copy at the same time. He read in silence, the weight of the findings pressing down in a way that no board vote, no media article had. This was undeniable. This was documented. This was structural. They didn't speak immediately. There was no need. Words would come later. Actions mattered now. The board convened urgently. The findings were summarized by the lead auditor. Recommendations included a review of leadership oversight, clarification of reporting structures, and immediate adjustments to internal governance protocols. Names weren't called, but the implications were obvious. Board members debated. Some pushed for rapid implementation. Others feared reputational damage if decisions were made too hastily. Yet the findings had weight. The narrative could no longer be controlled by subtle framing or deflection. Amina attended one of the follow-up meetings, formally invited to discuss her experiences and observations. She spoke with measured clarity. Each point referenced documentation, each concern grounded in evidence. No emotion beyond what the facts demanded. Her words were concise, strategic, unassailable. The room fell silent after she finished. The board, which had once treated her as a risk, now had to confront the reality she had embodied for months, that competence and integrity could not be dismissed by hierarchy or rumor. Ethan watched from the sidelines, noting the subtle shifts. Authority had been challenged, and the foundation structures were bending under the pressure of truth. But bending did not yet mean breaking. That would come next. Within days, actions were taken. Policies were rewritten. Oversight committees were restructured. Leadership training became mandatory. Communication protocols were clarified. The institution was reacting, not just to prevent recurrence, but to demonstrate accountability. Public statements were released carefully. The narrative shifted again, now emphasizing transparency, accountability, and reform. Amina's name was not sensationalized, but her role as a contributor to the process was acknowledged. The external reaction was measured. Analysts praised the foundation for corrective measures. Media coverage noted structural improvements rather than scandal. Amina observed all of it with quiet satisfaction. Validation had arrived, not as applause, but as acknowledgement that integrity could shape outcomes, even within a resistant system. Ethan reached out that evening. "You've done more than I imagined possible," he said. "I didn't do it alone," Amina replied, "but I had to do it." He nodded. And now, the foundation can't ignore what happened. That's the real victory. For the first time in months, Amina felt a weight lift. She had navigated scrutiny, rumor, and structural inertia, and emerged recognized, not just for surviving, but for shaping change. The final chapter wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about optics. It was about precedent, about demonstrating that courage and clarity could withstand pressure from power and perception alike. Ethan returned to his duties with renewed purpose. The temporary sidelining had ended, but the foundation's culture had shifted. Leaders, previously complacent, now faced tangible accountability. Decisions would be measured differently. Processes would be questioned. Integrity had been codified through action, not rhetoric. Amina resumed her projects, now fully integrated, her work visible and respected. Her presence was no longer seen as a risk, but as a standard-bearer for excellence and resilience. She was no longer just a participant. She had become a measure against which fairness would be evaluated. One evening, she reflected quietly, looking out over the city lights. Months of tension, uncertainty, and scrutiny had brought her to this moment. She realized the journey had shaped her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Self-trust, patience, and the knowledge that asserting oneself could alter even entrenched systems. Ethan joined her later, standing beside her on the balcony. They didn't speak immediately. The shared understanding between them was palpable. "You were right," he finally said. "About what?" she asked. "That change had to come from within," he replied. "Not interference, not shielding, but from integrity." Amina smiled faintly. "And now it has." The city stretched endlessly below, indifferent yet somehow reflective of their own resilience. Systems had been tested. People had been challenged. And in the process, two individuals had demonstrated the power of principle over perception. It wasn't a story of scandal. It wasn't a story of defeat. It was a story of endurance, influence, and the quiet victories that come from choosing integrity when every external force urges compromise. As they stood together, the weight of past tension gave way to possibility. The foundation had been tested. They had been tested. And the future, for the first time in months, felt both uncertain and undeniably theirs to shape. For those watching, the lesson was clear. Courage isn't loud, but it's impossible to ignore. And sometimes, standing firm isn't just about defending yourself. It's about reshaping the world around you. If you were in her position, standing between protecting your future and challenging a powerful system, what would you have done and why? Comment below and subscribe.